and thanks for your attention. Do you know why I would get a class's attention in that way instead of? When we're working with children of trauma, we have to think of all of the different ways that we might provoke a reaction for kids. Hi, my name is Mardi Bernard, and I'm a school mental health nurse, and today I'm going to talk to you about childhood trauma and what we can do in school to support these children. There's been some great studies happening around kids' trauma during the last 10, 20 years. In the 1990s, a great study happened with the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta and Kaiser Permanente, an HMO in San Diego, California. They looked at 17,733 adults and wondered about their health outcomes should they have had any adverse childhood experiences. The study became known as the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and health correlates became really apparent. So they asked these adults, who they already had their health records for, whether or not they had endured any of 10 adverse childhood experiences, including abuse, neglect, witnessing family violence, having an incarcerated parent, having a parent with a mental illness, and several others. They then compared these scores, which involved giving a yes or a no to each of those incidents, and looked at what happened to those people in later life. The outcomes were quite astounding in terms of health. What they found was that people who had endured 4 or more ACEs had a higher likelihood of heart disease, had a higher likelihood of pulmonary disease. People who had more than 6 ACEs had a higher likelihood of dying significantly earlier. In addition, they looked at outcomes for school and found that people who had endured 5 or more of the ACEs had significantly higher levels of behavior disorders and learning disorders in the school setting and had a hard time completing school. So when we're thinking about children of trauma, we need to think that A, the prevalence is way higher than we used to think. In fact, according to the ACE study, only 40% of people have had no ACEs. Most of us have had at least one childhood trauma. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is we need to challenge the myth that it's only the weak-willed who are impacted negatively by childhood trauma. There is no such thing as pull up your socks and get over it. Bessel van der Kolk, who's a great researcher in the field, calls it the body keeps the score. And what happens is that it seems to affect us for our entire lifetime, even when we think about dying earlier. So we need to be thinking that this is a serious issue. This doesn't impact just 1 or 2 children, and it's got nothing to do with being weak-willed or not wanting to do well. So as I said, the prevalence of childhood trauma is way higher than we used to think. Imagine then if 6 out of 10 kids in every classroom will have endured a childhood trauma. 6 out of 10. So in your class of 20, you have a dozen kids who have had at least one childhood trauma. The ACE studies also tell us that when there's one adverse childhood experience, there's more likely more than that. They seem to occur in clusters. So if we have a child who has experienced neglect, we must be looking for other traumas as well. And in trauma-sensitive environments, we assume that that may have happened for the kids. And we assume that behavior associated with poor school outcomes might be due to the experience of childhood trauma. Human brains are a wonderful thing, aren't they? We're born with between 80 and 100 billion neurons in our brain. And throughout our life, connections are made between those neurons. That's called learning. Every time we make a connection, that's learning. Some of our learning in our early days, the first 1,000 days, are very positive. We learn that when we cry, Mom comes and comforts us. We learn that when our diaper is wet, it gets changed. We learn if we smile at Mom, Mom smiles back at us. And that's a really important learning because it paves connections in our brain to vital parts that are going to be later needed in the school setting. However, the negative experiences also pave neuronal connections. So if the baby is crying in the crib and mom doesn't come, and the baby gets more and more agitated and mom doesn't come, and the baby is terrified and squeals and yells and no one comes, those connections are now being made not to the cortex, the learning part of the brain, but rather to lower parts of the brain that are set for survival. And that baby needs those connections in those early days in order to survive. But once they hit your classrooms, those connections aren't needed. Yet they're still there. So we see kids going into survival mode and having huge meltdowns in a classroom over what we think is nothing. And we wonder what that's all about. In a trauma-sensitive environment, we would assume that that's about an amygdala hijack. It's about the survival part of the brain trumping the smarter part, the learning part, the cortex. And we need specialized interventions to calm that body and to calm that brain. Now, the irony is, we have wonderful teachers in this province. We have caring teachers in this province who are so dedicated to making sure that all students can learn. The irony is that as educators or as health professionals, we are not going to know which children have endured which specific trauma on which day and whether they have 1 ACE, 0 ACE, or 6 ACEs. We are very unlikely to know that. And so rather than create settings where we pull children out who we think maybe witnessed a domestic violence the year before or the week before or the night before, we might think about creating environments where all children receive safe, welcoming, caring, and respectful strategies that will help them to overcome some of the lagging skills created by childhood trauma. And those lagging skills are pretty easy to spot. Educators know exactly what they are. Educators can tell you that children who are out of control, children who can't maintain their emotional state, children who can't pay attention even when maybe the instruction isn't as interesting as they'd like, those children have themes that we can see that are very similar, and in creating strategies for those lagging skills, we're supporting every single child in the school. There is no child who won't benefit from the skills that we're going to talk about today. So even without identifying each of these children, there are strategies that we can put into place in every school. And we might find that there are pockets in our population where there are more than 60% of the kids who have experienced a childhood trauma. We might find that there are some pockets where there are less. But overall, let's assume that about 60% of kids will have had this experience. And let's assume then that any behavior we see that's counterproductive to learning has its roots in an adverse childhood experience. Then we can truly create environments that all children can learn in. The first step in creating a trauma-sensitive environment is creating a safe environment. It's a great idea to poll staff and to poll children to look at how do you know when this classroom is safe? And in doing this work, we might find that the teachers or the adults' version of how we know the classroom is safe is way different than that of the kids. So we have lots of ways to ask kids about how safe it is in their classroom. But don't stop there. Begin to wonder, how safe is it in the bathrooms? How safe is it coming to school or leaving school? When we look at how trauma affects the brain, we know that it overpaves that connection to the amygdala or the survival part of the brain and underpaves the connection to the cortex, and particularly perhaps the prefrontal cortex, which makes flexible thinking, working memory, attention, focus, makes all of those areas of success really difficult for children. So begin to ask, Where are these children safe? How do they plan to be safe in a day? And begin to ask staff, how can we create classroom environments that the children know that safety is a primary focus? The first lagging skill that we like to talk about is that of emotional regulation. And we speak of this as a lagging skill. Ross Greene says that children will do well if they can, and if they can't, it's up to us to help them out, to look at what the lagging skill or the unmet need might be. And that's really how we're looking at children who have experienced adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We're looking at the idea that these experiences have blunted some of the growth in their brain and overpaved some of the connections to survival. So when we think about emotional regulation, teachers can tell you that if a child overreacts to the frustration of doing math a new way, or the child overreacts to having someone sit too close to them or talk when they're trying to concentrate, then we need to do some work on identifying, labeling, and expressing emotions. Ask your staff, what are we doing in our school to teach this lagging skill? Do we have a set of emotional words that we all agree on? Can we have a visual for those words? Can we, for instance, use a sad, mad, scared, and happy thermometer and have agreed upon words on each of those thermometers that all staff will use so that children can grow this lagging skill? Dr. Bruce Perry suggests that it might take us 1,183 repetitions to be putting some of these implementations in place, to be successful. So we need to be doing daily practice of emotional regulation skills. What might that look like? If you have a visual, for instance, for thermometers that have feelings on them in your class, you might think about doing daily feeling checks. How are you feeling today? What's going on that you're choosing to have that feeling? You might get a fair number of interesting stories out of this, but it's well worth it. Kids need that daily practice in order to repave the connection between emotional identification and the sensation in their body as well. So lots of the children who have experienced trauma might have some difficulty noticing that when they're frustrated, they get a rock in the pit of their stomach. And they might have a difficult time linking that to the feeling of frustration. Classrooms might use strategies such as drawing out body outlines and coloring in where they notice mad feelings or sad or scared or happy. It can be a very telling experience. We might assume that a child is having anger management problems, when in reality they are having a lot of anxiety and they're having a difficult time managing all of their worries. So we can be very creative in how we teach kids to identify, label, express, and regulate their emotional state. It begins with the vocabulary and it ends with daily practice. We must have daily practice. The second skill that we like to teach is in regards to teaching children how to focus and pay attention, even if the teacher's information isn't what they like to hear about. All kids can pay attention to Lego. However, when a teacher gets up in front of them and doesn't dress like a purple dinosaur and doesn't have bells and whistles, it takes prefrontal cortex action or executive function action in order to force yourself to pay attention. That's something that isn't inherently interesting. And again, the cortex may not be developing in the same way as the survival part of the brain. It may be underdeveloped. So we need to give children strategies so that they can listen to a teacher and get the information that they need. We also need to give teachers a lot of practice and a lot of skills in order to engage kids whose executive functions are not yet well developed. And that can be done in trauma-sensitive practices. Along with emotional regulation goes physiological arousal. So when I am red zone mad or furious, my heart rate increases, my breathing changes, my muscle tension changes, and it's very difficult to learn. One of the things that we need to tell kids is that in order for your brain and your body to learn, in order for you to learn, your brain and your body must be in a calm state. So we need to teach children a variety of strategies to calm their brain and calm their body. The first one we begin with is simply changing how the child is breathing. We use a breathing ball, perhaps, although there's a variety of tools that you can use. You don't need to buy a Hoberman sphere or a breathing ball. For today, we'll use it. So when I open this breathing ball, I want you to breathe in through your nose as if you're smelling something extremely pleasant, baking bread, a flower, something you like. And as you're breathing in, pretend that the air is filling your belly like a balloon and push out your belly. Breathe in very, very deeply. At the top of the breath, we're going to hold it for a few seconds, and then as you blow out, when I close the Hoberman sphere, blow out with some noise like this. And we're going to see if this works on you. So to begin with, put your shoulders up into your ears, and let's see how many breaths it takes before your shoulders come down. Ready? Breathing in. Blow it out. 4 more. 3. And last one, breathe in very deeply. With your fingers, how many breaths did it take you until you noticed your shoulders coming down? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Great. If you can do it in 1, 2, or 3, then you can probably use this skill when you are indeed heightened. When something has gone wrong and you're stressed and you need to calm your brain and body in order to learn, this might be a strategy that would work for you. It again requires daily practice. 1,183 times. In a 200-day school year, how many times is that we need to practice with kids in order for them to develop this skill? This is only one of the skills to de-escalate or to calm your brain and body. And it's one that you have to practice when you're calm to begin with. It doesn't work if the child is already escalated and you toss them the breathing ball and say, use this and then come talk to me when you're calm again. There's lots of other ways that you can teach kids this lagging skill. They may not learn that at home. They may not learn that calming yourself is a good thing to be doing. They may have learned, in fact, through experience, that when you're heightened, when you're furious, you get what you want. You get what you need in a home. And so we need to show them that in other settings, that's not how it works. That we can get what we need and get what we want when we're calm. The lagging skill of behavior regulation is a tough one with these kids. They simply can't regulate, and that's often hard for adults to get their head around. We think that they won't do it, that they're just holding out on us, but the reality is that they probably can't change their physiology. Their heart beats faster, their breath changes, their muscles tighten, adrenaline courses through their body. So they need that physiological de-escalation or de-arousal. And they may not know how to behave. They may not know how to react when stressful events are occurring. So we need to find ways to teach that to these children in a very direct fashion. Assuming they're going to learn it by look and learn, by watching well-regulated adults, doesn't really work well with these kids. Assuming that they're going to learn when we use punishment or consequences is also not likely to work because they simply can't do it. It's not that they won't, it's that they can't. So when we think of school discipline policies and we think about the difference between expulsion and suspension versus restorative practices, there's a huge gap there. If we really want to teach kids that they need to honor relationships and they need to fix mistakes and they need to repair relationships that they've harmed, then we need to be looking in a different way than punitive strategies would allow us to do. That's a challenge for all of us because that's all we've known. Many of us, that's all that we've ever seen used. Whether it worked or not, that's what we're used to. So conversations will need to take place regarding what would this look like, what training would we need, how could we use this in our school. The lagging skill of healthy relationships requires all of the other skill development. So if you are a child who hasn't been able to trust that when you cry, an adult is going to come, if you haven't been able to trust that two adults you care deeply about won't hurt each other in front of you, then it becomes really hard to trust adults in a school. No matter how often we say to them, you can trust me, I care about you. There are things that we're going to have to develop that will convince that child that indeed this is true. Indeed, adults in a school are caring, and we will keep your environment safe for you and make sure that you're welcomed into it. Conversations with staff members, conversations with parents are really important as we develop the lagging skill of healthy relationships as well. There's lots of games and activities that you can develop to play with kids that boost this up. It doesn't all have to be a stand and deliver speech around healthy relationships. We need well-regulated adults in our schools. When we think of the history of mankind and we think of hunting and gathering days, it's quite evident that there were more older people to help a younger child. So there were more teenagers, adolescents, there were more adults around to help young children grow up and help with that brain development. Our human brain has developed needing that, in fact. In hunter and gatherer days, I think that the ratio that is quoted is 1 child to 4 adults. And now we have classrooms of 1 child to 20, 25 or more students. And so we could think of this as rather a poverty of relationships for many of these children. It affects brain development. The number of adults around children affects whether they're getting the smiles that they need, whether they're getting the language-rich environment that they need, whether their needs are attended to quickly or not, and whether those neuronal connections towards survival are going to have to kick in a lot or not. So when we look at having few adults with many, many children, those adults have to be well regulated. They have to know how to identify, label, express, and modulate their own emotions, how to change their own physiological arousal, how to manage their own behavior so that they are always the role model for these children. And that is a challenge in schools. We work at a breakneck pace, and it's easy to become overwhelmed and stressed, and it's at that point that we're not very creative in our work and our strategies, and we need to find ways to support staff mental health when working in trauma-sensitive schools. Vicarious trauma is real. Vicarious trauma involves living what the child is living, adapting their symptoms, and losing sleep, losing your own mental health because of worrying about these children and because of being around them so much. We need to develop strategies in our educational system that honors that and that supports teachers who are immersed in this work.